Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Welcome to this seminar of Professor Bodo Winter. Professor Bodo Winter is here in our lab for this month. And so I anticipate that in case you are interested, you can contact him, etc., and arrange separate meetings. Professor Bodo Winter from University of Birmingham. Maybe some of you were already present in previous seminars, so I introduce him quite briefly, also because you might know very well his work. He has written two important books, one on linguistics and sensory aspects, and another on R, methodology. He is a linguist and works at the University of Birmingham. And he has done his PhD in UC Merced in USA, and his interests are rather broad within the field of linguistic and cognitive science and psychology also. So he focuses on gestures, on numerical cognition, on various analysis of corpora. He uses a variety of methodologies. It is really my pleasure to have him here. And this talk will focus on numerical cognition and numbers and communication. So welcome, Bodo, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Anna. And thank you, everybody out there, for being here today. Hey, yes. So I'm really excited about today's talk because it's actually going to be very different from the one last week. Last week was all focused on iconicity, if you were there. But today I'm going to actually be talking about a new project. So I recently got awarded what is called the Future Leader Fellowship. And it's a 4-year project similar in scope to an ERC. And so this project is very much underway. It's currently starting. And because of that, this talk will be a bit more sort of informal in the sense that I will be talking about new ideas, some existing studies, but it's going to be less finished. And that's actually perhaps a good thing because then we can have more room for discussion and also room for collaboration. So I'm going to start a screen share now. The project is called Making Numbers Meaningful, a multimodal approach to numerical communication. And what I want to do today in the talk is present you a vision for a research program. So what is the core idea of this 4-year project and why I think it's important to study numerical communication multimodally. I'll talk about some existing studies that we have done, some preliminary new findings, some planned studies, and at the end, there will be a lot of room for discussion and brainstorming. So I hope that this open-ended nature of this talk actually gives us room for discussion. Okay, the core idea is this. If we are thinking about numerical communication or the fact that the world is run by data, we have to think about the fact that when every day people are communicating using different communication channels. So if we have somebody producing a numerical communication, we have on the other end the decision makers. So for example, over here to the left, we have a data analyst. Maybe she's working for a hospital and she's presenting new numbers about how many hospital beds are needed in certain districts to the decision makers, who then use this information to change policy, to change organizational principles, and so on. And when we think about this process of communication from the data analyst to the decision makers, we have to think about the fact that this is actually using different communication channels at the same time. So oftentimes we present raw numbers, but we might also present graphs. There's all sorts of different data visualizations. We will also use language. So for example, vague expressions like more than, some, or probably, as well as metaphors. So expressions like rising prices, high numbers, which are expressions where numbers are talked about as if they were vertical. And if this is a real presentation, not in written format, then there will also be gestures, because whenever we talk, we gesture. And this is not just the case in this isolated example of somebody giving a presentation. It's really always the case. So, for example, in the UK, we had Boris Johnson giving press releases on coronavirus. And in these press releases, Boris Johnson would gesture, would use metaphors to talk about numbers, while also presenting graphs. And so this is an example of how language in this context is really very multimodal. Now, the problem is that in the research, approaches to studying numerical communication are rather siloed, sort of focused on individual pieces of this process. So, for example, psychologists have a decade's worth of research on lab-based experiments where most of the time the sort of standard task is to present a number to participants and then to ask participants to respond to this number. And we know a lot of how numerical cognition works from these very constrained experimental tasks. But the problem is that this research is very constrained. It's often focused only on the numbers 1 to 9. And of course, out there, people talk about all sorts of different numerical quantities, and we don't really know whether these findings from the lab generalize to real communication. Then there's a different research community, which is somewhat disconnected from the cognitive psychologists, and those are data visualization researchers, and they are very applied. For example, they would have their own conference. It's happening this year, Viz 2021. And a lot of this research is focused on which types of graphs are easier to understand than others. And that's really valuable. But the problem is that they don't actually study how these graphs are combined with language, which will always be the case out there in the real world. So here too, we have a sort of constraining factor that gets us further away from how numerical communication actually works. Then finally, we have linguists. So for example, I'm currently reading this book that's shown here on the right, which is all about quantifiers. So expressions like several, probably, and all of these vague expressions. And it's a great book, but it doesn't account for the fact that these expressions will be used together with graphs and together with gestures. And so because we have these different research communities that all focus on individual slices, we are sort of losing the bigger picture. And it's really worth emphasizing one more time that it's hard to find numerical communication that isn't multimodal. So here is a screenshot from a speaker talking about election results. And this person actually, in this one moment, in this one snapshot of time, there are actually at least 4 different communication strategies used to communicate numbers. So for one, we have here raw figures, percentages for election results. And they're also vertically associated, so the highest ones are on the top. While the speaker talks about a high number and does a gesture that is going upwards and uses the language high number. So we have like 4 different pieces of information here aligned multimodally. And open up any newspaper, coronavirus statistics, healthcare, finances, whatever, you will always find graphs together with language. And so we need to study how these pieces work together. Okay, so that's the sort of basic idea, and that's the motivation for my project, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on the next 4 years. What I want to do today is I want to focus on studies that we have already done, so that I can present you some actual empirical data. And they will actually be focused on individual slices of this process. We haven't done yet a lot of the research that looks at the interaction between these, but at least we're looking at pairs of this. So that's still better than just looking at one component. We're going to look at, in a first study, about gestures for numerical quantities. And I will convince you that they're super important and that gesture actually is a sort of really can be very treacherous and influence people in sort of subconscious ways. So it's really important to pay attention to gesture. In the second study, we will be looking at graphs and metaphors. And then in the third study, this doesn't quite follow into this framework, we're going to look at how language is perhaps biased towards addition. So this is a sort of new study that I am currently conducting, and I'm just sneaking it in because I wanted to talk about it. It doesn't quite fit into this nice setup. Okay, so let's focus on the first study. Metaphors and gestures. When we're talking about this, one of the background research that we need to review is the fact that across these different communications channels, it turns out that space is really important for numerical thinking. So there's a lot of evidence showing that spatial cognition and numerical cognition are deeply intertwined. And so I'll briefly review this because it's important when we look at gesture. So in general, numerical thinking is supported by what I like to call an ecosystem of spatialization. We have all sorts of different ways of spatializing numerical quantities. So for example, on the right-hand side here, you have an abacus, which is still very common in a lot of Asian cultures, children learn math there by basically mapping out numerical quantities on this physical device. And we have done things like that for a long time. So what you're seeing here on the left are some really old bones that have tally marks on them, which anthropologists think are numerical representations. So we seem to have done this for thousands of years. And across cultures, this is the case. So what I'm showing you here is a map of the numeral basis on the planet Earth from the World Atlas of Language Structures. And the blue dots on this map are all the systems that are decimal systems. Yeah, so those that have the base 10. And you see that there's a lot of blue. That is the most common system across languages. And why is that? Well, there's a spatial explanation for this because we have our body as a resource. And specifically, we have 10 fingers. And there's no viable other explanation for why it would be the base 10 in this case. We also know that the body plays an important role because the next most frequent system is base 20. That's vigesimal. And why is that? Well, because we have 10 fingers and 10 toes. And so that is then used as a resource for creating number systems. And that's an example of how sort of the spatialization of numbers can become reflected in the structure of languages. Now, moving on from these sort of different cultural facets of spatialization to more lab-based research, I think a lot of you are probably familiar with the Spatial Numerical Association of Response Codes, SNARC. The classic finding is that people are quicker to respond with their right hand to a relatively larger number and with their left hand to a relatively smaller number. And this difference in reaction time is supposed to reflect the fact that we have a mental number line with smaller numbers on the left and larger numbers on the right. We have a cottage industry of SNARC effects. Like, this finding has been replicated more than 100 times in many different facets. So it works with pointing movements. A larger number makes you quicker to point to the right. It works with foot responses. So larger numbers is faster with the right foot. With eye movements, so you're quicker to move your eye to the right if you are seeing a larger number. And there's some really cool studies that find that even when you're just writing down numerals into a touchpad, the number is slightly more displaced to the right spontaneously if it's a relatively larger number, and slightly more towards the left if it's a relatively smaller number. And there are many similar findings. This is just a sort of snapshot of this literature showing you that there's, no matter what the effector is, no matter what the outlet is, we seem to think about numbers from left to right, at least in the Western culture. Now, it's important to realize, so one sub-finding here that is going to be very important when we look at gesture is the fact that the SNARC effect also works if you're only having one hand. So there's a really cool study that used a go, no-go task. So, for example, you have to press one button, only one button, if you have an even number, or you have to press one button, only one button, if you see an odd number on the screen. And then people were free to choose either their right hand or their left hand. And it turns out that spontaneously, they're more likely to pick their right hand if it's a larger number like 8 or 9, and they're more likely to pick their left hand if it's a smaller number like 1 or 2. And what this suggests is that even at the response selection process, at that stage of action execution, you already find spatial numerical associations. And this finding will be quite relevant when we move to gesture, because gesture, of course, is also a selection of a particular type of action. Okay, so one thing that people sometimes forget or not emphasize enough, at least to my taste, is that there's not just one way in which numbers are spatialized. It's not just a mental number line going from left to right. There's also vertical snark effects. So if you put the response buttons like this, people are faster with a larger number for the up button. In a cool study, Hartman and colleagues have found that if you move a body upwards or downwards, and even if your eyes are closed, just the feeling, the sensation of moving upwards, while you are generating random numbers, so if you ask participants to say random numbers, 2, 7, 1, and so on, they will generate higher numbers when moving upwards and lower numbers when moving downwards. And we actually have a similar study, but we have found that when people look up versus down, when they look up, they're more likely to generate a higher number. When they look down, they're more likely to generate a lower number. And we actually found in this particular study that the vertical effect is stronger than the horizontal one. So for us, actually, and this is something, this will be a theme, we have found generally that vertical effects are stronger than horizontal snark effects. So actually one study in where we explored both of these mappings together was done by Greg Wooden, who's now a PhD student at University of Birmingham. You're going to see a lot of him in this talk because he's responsible for a lot of the studies. This was actually his undergraduate dissertation, and really proud that it actually made its way into Frontiers. And so what he did for his undergraduate is to have a 2D sheet in front of the participant, and people had to place stickers inside this 2D arrangement. And it's important that it's vertically mounted. It wasn't on the screen, on the table, but it was actually vertically mounted. And what he did is he asked participants to place the labels most, more, less, and least. Yeah, so the quantifiers, the vague approximate quantifiers, as well as time expressions, earlier, later, earliest, latest, as well as good, best, bad, worst. And so where do people spontaneously place them? And it turned out, if you're looking at this plot, that the quantifiers, so more, most, and so on, were placed vertically, much more so than horizontally. So people put them on a vertical line. Time expressions, on the other hand, went from left to right. So earlier, later, latest, and so on. And good and bad were also vertically associated. And interestingly, we did a follow-up study where we asked people to place numbers, and people placed the numbers horizontally. So one of the sort of things that we speculate about in this paper is that perhaps vague approximate quantities are more prone to being associated vertically, and precise quantities are more prone to being sort of listed from left to right. But this is certainly something that should be replicated, and we should look at this in different types of settings. Here we use the spontaneous sort of offline task. We don't have any online reaction time evidence for this. I think it's really nice. The offline task gives you the opportunity to sort of have a freer response, like people are free to place it anywhere and choose whatever mapping they want to use. But it's important now to follow this up with an online study. So if you're interested in these sort of axial representations of number, so left to right and vertical, we have a review paper on this, where we talk about how numbers are associated among different axes. I'm not talking about the third dimension here, which is the sagittal axis, but there's also some effects on that. Now, when we move to gesture, one of the things that will be very important is to talk about the fact that they're not only axial representations, but also size-based ones. So in terms of extent, more or less, bigger or smaller. A classic finding here is that you are quicker to respond to a relatively larger number if it's written in a bold font. I think that's really cool. If it's written in a non-bold font, you are relatively quicker with a smaller number. And that seems to say that people associate size, physical extent, with numerical quantity as well. And these studies have actually now been done using real actions. They're still size-based, but they use actual hand movements. So Oliver Lindemann concocted this beautiful device, which is measuring reaction times based on whether you're touching this device with a power grip, as if you are sort of grasping for a bigger object, versus a precision grip, which is what we use for small objects. And they found that power grips are faster for relatively larger numbers, and precision grips are faster for relatively smaller numbers. And I find this fascinating. It's showing that if we think about a bigger number, this automatically sort of is associated with a bigger grip aperture, with a bigger hand movement, as if the number was actually big in space. And perhaps to me, the most surprising result that I think is just the coolest is the fact that if people have just grasp blocks, and all the blocks are the same sizes. Yeah, so here the 8 block and the 2 block are exactly the same size. But if you write a larger number on it, people are going to widen their grip aperture more. Yeah, so even though the blocks have the same size, the number makes them extend their fingers more because they see that number associated with bigger space. And I think that's truly fascinating. So one of the things that now we want to do is when we move to gesture is we want to know whether these spatial numerical associations do exist also when people freely move their hands in 3D space. And that's one of the things that we can do by looking at gesture. We can sort of look at whether these lab-based findings extend to the real world. So that's the first study then. That's the background for the first study. And we use in this study the fact that language as well spatializes number. Specifically, we have both vertical and size-based language in English. So we talk about numbers as high or low. We talk about numbers as growing or huge numbers and tiny numbers. And then what we can do is we can use these spatial metaphors as a way of searching for gestures. Yeah, so this is once we can look at what are the expressions, what are the gestures that are being used when people talk about high or low numbers. So I'm going to talk about a very old study first. This was published while I was a PhD student, together with my supervisor, Tini Matlock. And what happened in this is, like, at the beginning of my PhD, I discovered the Internet Archive. I don't know whether you know the Internet Archive. They are the people who archive the internet, the entire internet. And one of the things that they archive is they archive all American television news, all of it. And it's freely accessible online. And so if you watch a show, let's say you watch, I don't know, Barack Obama give a speech on American television, next day it's already online and you can search everything that Obama has said because all American television is live captioned. And so you can actually search for expressions and then look at what images go together with those expressions. And if you're ever in San Francisco, I highly recommend going to their headquarters, which is actually in a rebuilt church. And where the organs are, they have the servers now, which is very sort of spiritual. I like it. So this is the building in San Francisco. And that's a screenshot of the TV News Archive. You can go there right now. If you Google TV News Archive, you can type in tiny number. And then in this case, you get 974 times that this has been set over the last 10 years of American television. And then you can click on the video and see what the speaker is doing. So in this particular study, we're not actually, in this particular study, we're actually looking at this data qualitatively. And this is partially because this was an easier thing to do first, but also in the gesture research community, there's a rich tradition of looking at specific examples in a lot of detail and sort of analyzing how one speaker uses a numerical expression and sort of analyzing it in the full richness. I will show you quantitative data in a second in a newer study. But let's have a look at some of these qualitative examples because I think they're really compelling. So this speaker, I hope that you can, that the sound works. So let's see that the sound works.
The first poll put him at 2.8% support. Even my candidates had higher numbers than that. Okay. See what I'm saying?
Could you hear that? Yeah. So one more time, the first poll put him at 2.8%. Even my candidates had higher numbers than that. So let's look at this one more time. Pay close attention to his gestures.
The first poll put him at 2.8% support. Even my candidates had higher numbers than that. Okay. See what I'm saying?
So there's a lot going on in this really short example. Let's first of all observe the fact that he's combining a precise numerical value with the vague expression higher numbers than that. And this is a sort of like constantly these two things are combined. But crucially, for higher numbers, he moves his hands upwards like this, clearly showing a vertical plane, than that. And so what's crucial here is that this than that refers back and creates a contrast along the vertical axis. Now, there's one other thing happening here, which is that he uses a sort of finger bunch, and he uses it on the left-hand side of his body, 2.8%, aligned with that expression. Now, this is where looking at one example is sort of limited. I think this clearly has something to do with numerical quantity, and I will present you quantitative evidence for this in a second. But of course, this could be he's making a small quantity on the left-hand side, but it could also just be for emphasis. It could be something where like maybe he's like a lot of speakers, they use the grappolo gesture, the finger bunch like this. And how can we know that this is necessarily related to quantity? For higher numbers than that, that is clear because we have the contrast. For 2.8%, it could just be emphasis, but it's compatible with the idea that it's size-based. Now, an even more compelling example is this one by this speaker. And I find this truly fascinating because this speaker gestures a lot while talking about many different quantities. So have a look at this.
175 million people on the thing now, adding a huge number of users every day. 6 billion people on the planet. Probably 3 billion of them with kind of modern grid electricity and maybe telephones. So maybe the total addressable market today is 3 billion people. 175 million to 3 billion is a big challenge.
So there's a lot of stuff going on. Notice that while he was talking about precise numerical values, he is creating contrast along the spatial axis, along the sort of spatial extent. And specifically, he talks about 6 billion people extending his hands the furthest, as opposed to 3 billion people. And it's that contrast, the fact that there's two different values along this size-based expression that really shows us that size and quantity must be the key factor here. It's also interesting that he talks about from 175 million to 3 billion moving along the left to right axis. Of course, this could also be change because it could be change from left to right. I'll show you this example one more time.
175 million people on the thing now, adding a huge number of users every day. 6 billion people on the planet. Probably 3 billion of them with kind of modern grid electricity and maybe telephones. So maybe the total addressable market today is 3 billion people. 175 million to 3 billion is a big challenge.
And what I also think is great about this example is that he's referring back to specific quantities and keeps his hand in the same spatial location. Okay, so, but that was like, you can look at the paper if you're interested. It has a lot of detail on examples like this, but who's to say that none of this is sort of like made up, isn't it? Because it's easy to look at an example like this and say, oh yeah, this could just be quantity, but it could also be something else. There's always another explanation in any given situation. And so we wanted to actually quantify this. So this is a study that came out last year, N+1, and we're really happy about it. Tiny numbers are actually tiny, is the name of the paper. Again, I have to emphasize, this is led by Greg Wooden, who's the PhD student on this, and he had to watch so many videos, poor Greg, to analyze this, because as far as we know, this is the biggest gesture study in history. So I am not aware of any other gesture study that has looked at more gestures. And what I will show you first is a snapshot of this data. I'm going to show you 3 years of American television from the expression tiny number. So you're going to see tiny number, tiny number, tiny number again from 2009 to 2013. This particular video was made that time. Now, just one thing I wanted to say, you're going to unfortunately see a lot of white male faces in this particular video. And that's because American TV news, in particular at that time, was quite biased. So this is not because we sort of selected this, but this is actually reflecting the bias of American television during that time. I just wanted to mention this as a disclaimer. Okay.
A tiny number.
Tiny number. Tiny numbers.
Tiny number.
Tiny number.
A tiny number.
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 Tiny number. Tiny numbers. Very, very small tiny number.
A tiny, tiny number.
A tiny number of a tiny number of
The tiny number of
Tiny number of
a very tiny number. A tiny number of
tiny numbers.
tiny number.
Tiny numbers.
a tiny, tiny number.
Yeah.
Of
Tiny number.
tiny number.
So that was 3 years of American television seen from the perspective of this gesture. So now, of course, what I haven't shown you is how many of those cases, well, when was tiny number set without this gesture? And that's what we're going to look at. So what we did in this study is we looked at the expressions tiny, huge, large, and small number. We randomly selected 800 videos that we scraped from the TV news archive, which led to 3,200 videos to be analyzed. Now, that sounds like a lot, and it is. And it was a lot of work for Greg, but you actually only end up with 681 usable videos. So what do we mean by usable? And we have the criteria is that the speaker is visible, that the hands are visible, and that the hands are not occupied. Yeah. So, for example, if somebody holds a microphone or holds a paper or holds their hands to the podium the entire time, then we would classify that as the hands are occupied. And so you actually end up with a very so even though you start analyzing lots of data, then you end up with a relatively small data set. So that's the sort of sad thing is with this approach, you need to look at a lot of TV news before you actually get a lot of videos. Now, that being said, this is still a massive data set because we have 584 unique speakers in there. So that's gestures from more than 500 people. And that's the biggest one that I know of, at least. There's a few people who are multiple times in this data set. Jim Cramer, Donald Trump. Jim Cramer, for those of you who don't know, he has a finance show, and that's why he comes up a lot talking about numbers. Donald Trump, Barack Obama, some of the sort of usual suspects. But most people are revealed only once in this data set. So that's great, actually, because we can then look at whether these results from small lab-based studies about size-based associations can be found in naturalistic context with many more speakers. So we coded the data for a bunch of different aspects of size because size can be reflected using the hands in different ways. And the first thing that we looked at is we looked at the hand configuration. So basically within the hand, are you producing what we call a closed hand? So any precision grip or like this, yeah? Or an open hand where the index finger and the thumb are not approaching each other. And we found some cases that were sort of in between and we call them curved, which is sort of like when people do this. yeah, which is hard to classify. It's neither fully closed, but it's not fully open. So we created this extra curved category. Now I should say that for this, we have very high inter-rater reliability. So we took a random set of this and got a second rater, and I'm only showing you the results for which we have high inter-rater reliability. So tiny number, that expression attracts a lot of closed hand shapes. Yeah, a lot of like this. Now, I want to emphasize that actually this black bar, the no gesture type, look how small that is. Yeah, look how few people in TV news actually produce no gesture. So the majority of expressions, when people say tiny number, they produce some form of gesture. And I think that already is really important to sort of acknowledge that when people talk about tiny numbers in TV news, American politics, then all of a sudden gesture is there. And it's there most of the time, more often than not. Yeah. Small number, the picture already changes. So we have more open-handed gestures, and that then becomes even more extreme for large numbers and even slightly more extreme for huge numbers. So there's a nice progression because tiny is less than small, which is less than large, and is less than huge. And we have this nice sort of progression from mostly precision grips for tiny number and less precision grips, more open hand, and an even more open hand for the larger numbers. And we actually fit this with a Bayesian logistic regression model, closed versus open. And we have an ordinal factor in there, and there's an ordinal effect. Yeah, so there's like tiny is more precision grip than small than large. And this is also, of course, with a random effect for a speaker because some people are multiple times in this data set. Okay, now you might say, wait, Bodo, what's with this open hand over here? Isn't that against your hypothesis? Because here the hand is open. Well, actually, no, because you can show size in multiple different ways. For example, with an open hand, I can do this. Yeah. And so the other thing that we looked at is we looked at whether the hands are narrow, which we use the torso as a reference point. So narrow, medium, and wide. So wide is larger than torso. Medium is about torso height, and narrow is less than torso. And we use the torso as a reference point because in American TV news, you see people from slightly different perspectives and at different distances. So you can't measure this in any sort of real accurate way. You have to use some reference point. And we find that there are more narrows for tiny, quite a few still for small, then less of those for large, and then even more of the wide ones for huge. So again, a sort of really nice pattern and a really strong effect. And then you can look at those that move. Yeah, so sometimes people have a static sort of expression. Sometimes they move inwards and outwards. And this is, again, a really clear pattern where for large and huge, people move the hands outwards. For tiny and small, they move them inwards. So this is a more dynamic depiction of the same thing. And then finally, going back to the horizontal associations, we can look at those that are single-handed. And remember that result about response selection. Is it the case that people are more likely to gesture with their left hand when they talk about smaller numbers? And we found no effect whatsoever for this. So it's not the case that speakers are more likely to select their right hand when talking about a relatively larger number. Okay, so this is actually already that study. What are some of the take-home points here? What can we conclude from this? So first of all, we can see that gesture is ubiquitous in this domain. 80% of the time on average, did we see a gesture when the speaker was also visible? And that's really important to emphasize. Then we have seen that there are multiple realizations of size and that there was no effect of right left hand choice in this particular, in gesture at least, but we did find these size-based associations. I would like to emphasize that this is really nice because it's showing us that the lab-based, size-based results do extend to a naturalistic media context. So I would say that they sort of add ecological validity to spatial numerical associations. and also generalizability. And generalizability both across speakers, like many different speakers, but also generalizability across numbers, because tiny number in this data set can be 10 people or it can be 10,000 people. And the lab-based studies only look at the numbers 1 to 9. So this is actually showing us that these size-based associations extend to the whole number range. And what matters is what number is big or small in context. And then finally, I think from a methodological perspective, this shows us that the TV News Archive is a great resource. It's freely available that can be used for studying all sorts of interesting gestural patterns. So I highly recommend for you to look at this. If you're interested in sort of like, for example, abstract concepts like Anna is, one could look at what are the gestures that go along with different abstract concepts, for example. Okay. And I want to just briefly say a follow-up idea that this study has spurred that I currently don't have the time to implement, but like this would be something interesting to do, is to do the random number generation with expanding or contracting hands. So people have to say numbers like 7, 8, 2, and so on, while moving the hand outwards and then inwards again. And I would say that that's now much more ecologically valid and more realistic than the head movements. The head movements are just sort of like an artificial task, but now that we know that people produce these gestures, it makes sense to bring this back into the lab. Okay, I realize that I am running a bit out of time because I am going to now talk about a different study. We might, like, by the way, I have timed this talk to be 1 hour, so we have about 20 minutes left. But one important thing that we now need to study, that now that we know that people do these gestures, the question is, does it matter? Could it be that people are just gesturing and you're not being influenced by the gestures? I mean, that's a viable opportunity, like possibility. We know that speakers gesture for themselves. It helps us speaking. So who's to say that the gestures actually change what number you have in mind? And so one of the questions that I want to investigate in the future is to know whether the gestures actually influence understanding. Does it matter for perception? And I want to do a quick tangent here and talk about a new JEP paper that we have that shows that gestures matter and actually influence what you think about, but not for number, but for time. Yeah, a different abstract domain. But it's a really clear demonstration. And then I want to show you ways in which we can use this paradigm to also test whether gesture changes number. So this study, I'm super proud of this study because the results are so clear. So English turns out to also have a spatial way of thinking about time, not just number. And specifically, we can think about ourselves as moving through time towards a time point. So, for example, if you're saying, we are approaching Christmas. We are approaching Christmas. We are moving through time towards Christmas. But there's also the moving time perspective. Christmas is coming. In this case, we are standing still and Christmas moves towards us. And English has both of these expressions in the language. And cognitive scientists and cognitive linguists think that these spatial frames also correspond to different ways in which we think about time. And one of the key ways which this has been tested with is the next Wednesday question. I don't know whether you've heard of this, but it's a very famous question. And it goes like this. Next Wednesday's meeting has been moved forward 2 days. What day is it on now? Notice that this has two possible answers, depending if you're assuming this perspective. So next Wednesday's meeting has been moved forward 2 days. That will be Monday. Yeah, next Wednesday's meeting, Wednesday to Monday, or next Wednesday's meeting has been moved forward 2 days into the future, and that will be Friday then. And so lo and behold, this question actually, if you ask American English speakers, 50% of all people say Friday, and about 50% of all people say Monday. And this is now, there's so many studies on this that this is actually based on a meta-analysis. This is a meta-analysis. The meta-analytic mean is 54%. And so now the question is, can gesture change whether you think Friday or Monday? And that would be a great demonstration that gesture actually influences, in this case, what time you have in mind. And so what we did is we showed people videos where a speaker asked this question, either moving the hand forward or moving the hand backward. I'm showing you our stimuli with a familiar face, actually with the same shirt.
Next Wednesday meeting has been forward. What's the now?
Yeah, I'll do that one more time. You don't have to listen to it, of course, because it's four voices at the same time.
Next Wednesday meeting has been forward. What day is now?
So those were our stimuli, and we showed them to people on Amazon Mechanical Turk, a sample of 200 people. And the question then is, does forward or backward? And we tried out 2 different hand shapes, where the forward or backward dimension matters. And so for the flat hand shape, so this one, notice that this is a huge effect. So Monday responses, which is yellow, if you're doing backward, 75% of all people say Monday. If you're doing forward, 75% of all people say Friday. Yeah, that's a really big effect. And the same thing for the push gesture. So that's this one. So it doesn't seem to matter in this case, which ones of these 2 hand shapes. And what we then did is we wanted to look at how much can gesture do this without language. Can gesture push you along the timeline without language? And so in a follow-up experiment, we asked people, next Wednesday's meeting has been moved by 2 days. So not having forward or backward, yeah, no spatial adverb. Or we asked them, next Wednesday's meeting has been changed by 2 days. And so change is a non-spatial verb, yeah? So basically, does it work without the spatial adverb? And does it work without the spatial, without any spatial verb? And there's still an effect, but move seems to be a bit Friday biased, forward biased. But there's still an effect that the forward hand shape gives you more Friday responses, but it's weaker without the word forward. And actually the effect is absent, completely absent, if you're using non-spatial language. So if you just say change by 2 days, then the gesture does nothing. And this is actually really cool because it shows us that the gesture depends on the corresponding language. So if you're just saying change by 2 days, people are like, what is this guy doing with his hands? Yeah, because the language isn't spatial and therefore doesn't change Monday to Friday. So in that sense, then the gesture only works together with the right linguistic context. And now just a quick side component to the study, which I think some of you who are more interested in social context will be really fascinated about. We found, luckily, we did this online experiment with a debriefing question. So we just asked, what do you think about the experiment? Yeah. And it turns out that people described, spontaneously talked about the person. Yeah. So some people said nice things about me. Some people said he was very articulate, or he seemed like a nice guy, but other people said less nice things. So for example, he is native to the US and uses odd hand gestures. He's a bit odd. Is he from a different planet? And then one person says, he seems like he wants to be a mentalist. Now, when we looked at these responses, we're thinking, well, okay, people seem to be really compelled to talk about the person, and they spontaneously say that they either like the person or they don't like the person, or they sort of see them as an other. And this gave us a crucial idea. This was after the first experiment. We then said, okay, if people are responding this in the debriefing question, we should add a likability scale and just ask, do people like the speaker? And we then, I'm showing you here the data for low likability versus high likability. So those people that like the speaker more. And it turns out that the gesture effect is stronger for those that liked the speaker more. And what's fascinating about this is that it shows you that liking the speaker manipulates the perspective. So if I'm saying next Wednesday's meeting has been moved forward 2 days, my hand is coming towards you. Well, from my perspective, that's further away from me, that would be Friday. But if you're not assuming my perspective, you just see something moving closer to you, and that will be Monday. And so we found then that likability modulates this effect. And I think that's really cool, and actually opens up all sorts of cool explorations for perhaps explicitly modulating whether the person is nice or not nice, and whether that changes gesture perspective. And it's a really cool example of how the same gesture seen from 2 different perspectives has opposite interpretations. Okay, so going back to numerical language then, one of the studies that we have planned, that is not yet done, but we're currently designing this and pre-registering it soon, is we want to have expressions like this. 1,000 people were at the protest, several of them got arrested, or 1,000 people were at the protest, several of them got arrested. So with a small or large gesture. And we know that several is vague. And so the question is, does that change your numerical estimate? Can the gesture actually influence which number you have in mind? And just like with the next Wednesday question, we're using an ambiguous expression here. Okay, cool. So in the interest of time, what I'm going to do, because this study will also be presented by Greg next week at ESLP, for those of you who are going to be there. So I'm going to actually save you this and skip the study, but it's basically showing, looking at spatial numerical associations and graph perception. Yeah, so it's a sort of looking at whether these lab-based findings also matter when people interpret graphs, which are, of course, a spatialization of number. So I'm going to skip all of this, so that we have time for the final bit of research that we have currently done, that I'm really excited about, which is whether language itself may have a bias towards addition over subtraction. So is the language we use biased towards a particular mathematical operation, towards adding things rather than taking them away? And I think this is actually really important and also has important practical applications. The motivation for this study is that there's a new Nature paper by Gabriel Adams. It's an excellent study. If you haven't read this yet, it's hugely important. It proposes a new heuristics, a new cognitive bias. So this is sort of in the tradition of Kahneman and Tversky, where we know there's all sorts of different heuristics and biases. And this one is actually, for the first time for a long time, proposing a completely new cognitive bias. And specifically, this cognitive bias is supposed to be that people are more likely to add things when you ask them to change anything than to subtract things. And this matters on a day-to-day basis. So one of their experiments, they asked people to change a recipe. Can you improve this recipe for the sandwich? And people added ingredients rather than taking them away. They looked at policies, and specifically when you're in an institution and you have a department meeting, for example, and you're like, hey, we need to change our admissions program. Like, we need to change something about admissions because our admissions numbers are low. People will tend to add new measures rather than thinking about the possibility of subtracting something. And oftentimes in institutions, that's really dangerous because you then add layers of more stuff, more new forms and so on, rather than taking them away, which is an option that you should consider. And this bias is so deep that you can even find it in one of their studies. They had displays like this, and people were asked to make them more symmetrical. So if you're making this more symmetrical, you can either do that in this task by taking green dots away or by adding green dots. And they found that people were much more likely to add the green dots. Yeah, so even it didn't occur to them that they could take dots away. And crucially, this was even the case when people had to pay real money. They got less reimbursement for the experiment for every green dot that they added. And in fact, so if you get, if you as a participant get 10 cents less for each green dot that you add, you will still add the green dots rather than take them away. And even if the instructions highlight that you can take them away. And so this is showing us that there seems to be a cognitive bias towards adding things rather than subtracting things. And the question that we had then, this is work with Martin Fischer in Potsdam, was to see whether perhaps the instructions already are biased. And that's not necessarily a complaint about their experiments. It's actually more a sort of deeper possibility that perhaps this bias towards addition is so rampant and so widespread in our culture that language in general is biased towards addition. And when you say the word improve or the word change, which is the words they use in their instructions, maybe those are already biased towards adding things. So in general, it is the case that one way in which language can reflect cultural biases is through word frequency statistics. Yeah, very simply, things that are more important to us, we tend to talk more about, all else being equal. For example, we have shown this in this study with Asfa Majid, where we've looked at the fact that Western culture, which is vision biased, also uses more vision words more frequently. And so that's just one example of how frequency reflects a bias, in this case, for particular sensory modality. And so one of the things that we are looking at in this upcoming study is the fact that add words are more frequent than subtract words. So, for example, add in the corpus of contemporary American English is 75 times more frequent than the verb subtract. Addition, the noun, is 110 times as frequent. And it's not just these words, but it's also plus versus minus. Plus is 10 times more frequent. More, the quantifier, is 7 times more frequent than less. Most is 3 times more frequent than least. So these are all really nice pairs. You can think of them as pairs. And in each one of these cases, we have more for the addition category than for the subtraction category. So people talk more often about adding things. Yeah, and that I think is a clear sort of one dimension of this this bias. And now a more subtle one is we can use distributional semantics to look at whether the meaning of improve and change words is closer to the meaning of addition words than to the meaning of subtraction words. So here I'm using word embeddings. This is basically a way of using co-occurrence data in text to infer the meaning of a word, because words that you can learn about the meaning of a word by looking at the company that the word keeps. Yeah, so what words does something co-occur with? And words that have similar profiles, that occur in similar types of contexts, tend to have similar meanings. And that's been confirmed again and again. And so I'm just using this existing data that's been trained on the Wikipedia corpus, where over here is the similarity in semantic space, inferred from text data, to the words add and addition, or the words subtract and subtraction. And so here we have to change, to alter, to mutate, so all sorts of synonyms of to change, so words that are neutral in principle, they should be neutral with respect to addition or subtraction, but they're actually closer in semantic space to addition than to subtraction. And this is a pretty consistent pattern, like for each one of these verbs, they're closer to the addition words than to the subtraction words, more similar to them in their usage. And the same thing goes for improved words. And what's cool about this is that this is showing us that the word to change, yeah, which shouldn't suggest addition or subtraction, is actually biased towards addition. When you're saying, let's change this, this suggestion comes with the assumption or the suggestion that you should add something rather than subtract something, because the meaning of to change is closer to add than to subtract. I think that's really cool. And it's showing us that it's hard to evade this cultural bias towards addition. So we are basically adding to these behavioral results by saying, well, actually, yes, language is, so there's a general cultural bias towards addition, and language reflects this, both in terms of frequency data and in terms of the semantics of even very neutral words, which are biased towards addition. Okay, so I want to wrap up here. That was a study that was a very new one. It's unpublished yet, on language and addition. Sort of got us a little bit away from this matrix. There's so much that we need to do for the next 4 years. My postdocs will be starting next year on this project. And there's so many different interactions between these different modalities that we can look at. We can look at, for example, whether vertical language makes it easier to understand a vertical plot. Whether size-based language might be better for pie charts, and so on. There's all sorts of interactions that you can look at. And it would be important to do so because, as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, all of this is used together. And I think it's really important to sort of take a more ecologically valid perspective on numerical communication, trying to take things out of the lab and looking at how they're used in communication. So that is actually this talk. That is a sort of overview of some of the stuff that we've done in this space and what we have planned to do in the future on this project that is called Making Numbers Meaningful. Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you. And I'm looking forward to your questions.
So thank you so much, Bodo, for the great presentation. Really excellent, very clear. All the studies I understood, I think everything, which is rare. So
okay,
very clear and to the point. So I would leave the floor open for questions and observations, etc., etc.
Questions, ideas.
Hello, can you hear me? Hi, yeah. My name is Elisa Scerrati. Thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. I have a few questions. And the first one is related to your last topic. You said that the word change is associated with addition. And I was wondering whether you considered whether changing context in which change is used may make a difference.
Oh, yeah. I bet you it does. Do you have a specific example in mind? Like, so
I was just thinking about it. I was just wondering whether.
No, I think you're right. I mean, 100%. So one of the issues actually with word vectors in general is that they're an average, at least these ones that I'm using, they're an average representation across all contexts.
Okay.
So naturally, the actual meaning of the word change will differ depending on how it is used. But because the word vector is an average, it shows us that there are probably more contexts in which it is closer to addition than in which it is closer to subtraction. But I think it's a really interesting question to look at whether particular types of context, and actually, Elisa, it's actually an important question. It's like, how can we encourage people? How can we create a context to get people to think about subtracting something?
Right.
Because otherwise, I mean, for example, institutions are just going to add layers of new forms and new things. Like we need to, at department meetings, we need to like remind ourselves of the fact that, oh yeah, we have this bias towards adding things. We need to think about the opportunity, but maybe getting rid of something is easier and better. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. And a few other questions, if I can.
Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned at the beginning that approximations are more strongly related to a vertical line, whereas precise measures to an horizontal line. What could be an explanation for this phenomenon?
Yeah.
If you have anything in mind about it.
Excellent question. So if I'm honest with you, we don't know. Yeah, we don't know yet, because we haven't experimentally manipulated the explanation yet. We've just found that vague quantifiers are more vertical and exact numbers are more horizontal. I think there are multiple possibilities here. So one thing is that language has the vertical mapping. Yeah, so language has high and low number, but it doesn't have the left to right mapping. So we don't talk about numbers. And so we know this from lab-based studies, but we don't talk about numbers as more to the right and more to the left, the same way that we don't say this is a right number, the same way that this is a high number. And so I think one possible explanation is that language being more strongly, like a linguistic task, might activate vertical associations more strongly. And so quantifiers, which are linguistic, might have a stronger vertical bias than numbers, which are slightly less, especially if you use numerals, which are slightly less linguistic.
It would be interesting to test this.
It would be very interesting to test. So one way of testing this idea is to use number words versus numerals.
Okay.
Because the number words should be slightly more biased towards vertical, and the numerals, which are less linguistic, so to say, should be more horizontal. But it could also be that it's about approximation. It could be that the approximate nature of something is that makes it high or low. And so teasing that apart will be a bit harder. So one has to think about maybe less approximate numerals, like rounded numbers or something like that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elisa. Other questions?
Grazie, thank you.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for your very interesting talk. One question is related to the study where you analyzed numerical gestures in television. Very interesting. I was wondering, it would be interesting also to see how much space there is for cultural differences in gestures in gestures for numbers.
Yeah, I mean 100%. Do you want to switch on your sound?
Sorry.
Okay, yeah, 100%. I agree with you, Francesca. So because of course we know that the number line is cultural. So cultures that write from right to left show the opposite association. It would be really cool if people gestured differently as a function of, for example, their writing system. Now, the one thing that I'm a bit concerned about here is that so we haven't found the right to left effect in our data with the hand selection. And the problem is that movement along the axis is really hard to quantify. So it's really hard to sort of like because people are doing all sorts of weird in the TV data, all sorts of weird movements. And so that's why we focused on size, because it's much easier to sort of say, aha, okay, the distance between these two versus that, as opposed to like, I don't know, something like this. If you're seeing that in a video, does it go right? Like, is this more diagonal and so on? So I think you're 100% correct. It's super important to look at this. The problem is that this is going to be hard with TV News Archive data. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question, the SMARC effect that you talked us about, has it been documented also in preschoolers? For example, using dots instead of numbers, of course. This would be interesting to know, to understand if this effect is related to going to school and learning to write numbers and to read.
Yeah, that's a good point. I I'm not much of a developmental psychologist, so I know that there's studies on the SNAC effect in children, but I forgot what the results were. Like, so I don't know exactly. And Anna is also just like, if anybody knows, they can chime in. But yeah, that would be interesting, Francesca. But actually, let me just say one thing. So about the sort of school perspective. So I'm focused in this particular study, I focused on adult speakers. There's actually really rich tradition of research by Susan Golden Meadow in particular, that has looked at gestures in mathematics education. And there's also a lot of anthropology work and education, sort of like detailed fine-grained analysis of classroom discussions, which show that gesture is hugely important in classrooms. But I do not know about the SNAC effect in this particular case. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. And one very last question, maybe a little strange, but have you found in your studies gender differences in the numerical understanding and using gestures related to numbers?
Yeah, we have data. So for the Amazon Mechanical Turks study, which we decided not to collect information on gender. So my sort of principle is that if you're not going to use it in the analysis, then I also don't want to collect it because if we don't hypothesize gender to play a role, in the TV News Archive data, which is a bit biased towards male, so on average, I think it's about 70% male speakers in the TV News Archive data, we haven't actually looked at this. And that's because I'm not to say that there shouldn't be a difference, but I sort of want to stay away from that discussion. It turns out that for example, the differences in spatial cognition between men and women, that literature is quite a minefield because it depends on so many different factors. And we just did not want to make it about gender. So we sort of like decided not to look at it and make this. But I should say, like, if I think it's an interesting question, if that's the research focus, to look at gender in this context as well. I think that would be interesting. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yes, I have a question. Do you think that the speed perception in a movement can affect the number processing and the number operations, like addition and subtraction?
Sorry, can you repeat that question one more time?
Do you think that the perception of the speed of a movement can affect the number processing and number operation, like subtraction, addition?
That's really cool. I bet you it would, and I think that's an interesting research question. So there's the operational momentum effect, which is so if you see things moving towards the left, that is associated with addition. And things moving to the left, to the left with subtraction and to the right with addition. But I'm not aware that the researchers have manipulated speed. And I think gesture is an interesting example where perhaps you could look at gestures of different speeds. So for example, it's not only going to be, because of course, a faster gesture is also more salient, isn't it? And it might have a stronger influence on your perception so actually this might be something that we might do as a follow-up study in our gesture quantifier study, whether the speed with which you extend your hands makes you, gives you bigger estimates or smaller estimates. That's a cool idea.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Luca.
Yeah, very simple clarification question about, I was intrigued by your, in study 2 of the modulation of likability on the effect of the gesture. I was intrigued with your explanation. So if I understood correctly, the idea is that the exogenous effect of a likability would influence my perspective taking and then would facilitate my understanding of your gesture or using your gesture. So if this is true, I was wondering just whether, would you expect an interference effect in which you have, let's say, the sentence without the gesture, So the sentence is ambiguous, but then you ask the responder to make somehow a prime gesture of towards or away the body, and to whether the gesture itself affect the meaning and independently of the communication, let's say, act. Because I mean, of course, when you say move toward or move away, this is also, I mean, usually the gesture are considered as communicative signals. It is very conventional that we interpret. Of course, you prime a specific interpretation. I was wondering whether you could demonstrate the causal effect of the gesture by having the listener doing the gesture, so that a more compatible interpretation would be probable, and maybe it's stronger evidence. I don't know.
Yeah, that's pretty cool, Luca. Let me say a few things about this, Luca. First of all, Lara Boroditsky and colleagues, they have done the next Wednesday question with spatial primes. So if you prime people about movement in a particular direction without gesture, so in a completely non-gestural task, you get more Friday if you prime a forward response, and more Monday if you prime a Monday response. And it's quite surprising, actually. Lara's studies, some of them, if people are waiting in a line to go somewhere, they're more likely to respond Friday because they're thinking about sort of moving further in the line. But for example, if they're at an airport waiting for something for their friend to arrive, they're more likely to respond Monday. So it actually works in many different contexts. So it works with general spatial primes. Now, the study that you suggest, Luca, is a bit hard to do, I would say, because how are you going to instruct somebody to use a gesture to produce it without also performing the gesture? I mean, one thing you could do is you could stand next to them and produce the gesture in the same direction, so that then there's no perspective taking difference. But I think there are other ways of testing this idea. Now that we've found this correlation, or we found that likability modulates the effect, we can explicitly manipulate likability. So rather than having it as a sort of covariate in the analysis, we could, for example, make the person say something really nice at the video, or say something really not so nice, and then see whether that changes gesture perspective, because that would then be an experimental manipulation. Another thing that one could do is one could perhaps do even something like closer to the screen or farther away from the screen, because we know that we like things more if they are closer to us. So that might be another way of manipulating this. There are all sorts of, now that we have this suggestion, and I should say suggestion, I mean, at least in 3 experiments, we found this in our JEP paper, but it's still using only the sort of naturalistic variation in likability. I think it's a really cool follow-up to actually look at how, with the same paradigm, this actually works experimentally using an experimental manipulation.
Yeah, just a follow-up of Lucas' question. No, I was also intrigued by this work, and I was thinking of, for example, in a lab, to control for aspects that typically, or to manipulate aspects that are typically related to motor resonance. So you explicitly ask whether they like the other person, but you could, here gender comes into play once again, gender, but in a lab, so you gender, or I don't know, ethnicity, if we can use this. Could be interesting to see whether gestures are more effective in these cases. It's something like adding more than subtracting.
I like it. No, I mean, actually, that's a great idea. So you could use I mean, on average, it should be that men have more of the perspective with men and women more with women. You could then see whether basically, if you are within group manipulation, so if you're of the same group, where you generally have more motor resonance, you should also then have more perspective alignment in this task. I think that's another way of addressing this. So what I like about this result is that this totally sounds like a journal of social psychology paper, like experimental social psychology in the making. What's nice about the next Wednesday effect, by the way, the one thing that I like, I'm a huge fan of it because it is so crazy robust. So I do this as a sort of party stunt on open days. So when we have in the UK, we always have to give sort of presentations to future students and parents, and I always split the room in half, and they have to close their ears and eyes, and then I do ask the question, one half of the room with this question and one with the other, and it's a great demonstration because it always works. I've never found a room of people where it doesn't work. And that's very different from a lot of other results, like the snark effect, for example. I mean, even though it's quite robust, it's still more flimsy than even this result. And so it gives you a lot of wiggle room in terms of effect size to then push it around with the social manipulation. Other questions?
I have another question if there is no one. So the distinction between the dimensions. So you spoke about the vertical dimension, which might be more crucial than the horizontal dimension. Yeah, in this case, it would be interesting related to Francesca's question on literacy, because it could be that the vertical dimension is more, I don't want to say innate, but more related to our everyday experience. Whereas the horizontal dimension might be acquired through schooling, etc. So linked to writing or to stuff like that. This is one aspect. And also, out of curiosity, in one study years ago, we also introduced the circular, the clockwise dimension. So any thoughts on that? So
I think I'm going to stay away from circles. I like axes. Like, this is very German, sort of like, I like very sort of right angles. Circles are too hard. So when it comes to the vertical, like, I think you're right. So the vertical effect, of course, is supposed to be grounded in a sort of embodied explanation. We see things rising up, like if you put cookies on a pile, more piles means more up. And therefore it should be more culture independent, because this is a basic fact of nature, isn't it? Like, any culture makes the same experience. But I also think it's important from a sort of, from gesture, when we now look at gesture, like, why do we not, like, our body we have a clear axis here. Left and right, we know is very confusable across individuals, and left and right also never makes it into language for metaphor. There's no linguistic metaphors that are other than left and right politically, which is based on the parliament in the way it just happened to be. But left and right is just not robust enough. And I think the verticality is not only more embodied, but it's also less variable between individuals. And I think that's one of the reasons why I would expect more vertical metaphors in gesture than left to right ones. But it's going to also be harder to investigate, isn't it? Because if somebody moves their hand to the right, again, perspective taking, are they doing that because they're doing it from their perspective or from the other perspective? So left and right is just intrinsically more flimsy than is up and down. So I don't know, I like things moving on this axis more so than this axis. Yeah.
Other questions? If there are not, then I would like to thank you again. Thank you again, Bodo. Thanks, Bodo, again.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for the 2 seminars, which were really, enlightening for us and insightful. And thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for being here today.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Ciao. Ciao to everybody. Ciao.
Good.
Very nice.
Cool.
Very cool.